Good. Aren't you guys selling IDEO now?
Actually, yeah, that's a little known fact, Bruce, thanks. That I'm not really involved with, but at the same time, we had a great 10-year, little over 10-year relationship with IDEO. If anybody doesn't know IDEO, they're quite an amazing innovation and think tank out on the West Coast. And what really happened over that 10 years was really the vision of the CEO, Jim Hackett, was to get everybody in the company to begin to think like designers. So that he made my job quite easy in the sense that everybody now in one sense starts to understand the process or the codified methodologies of approaching a problem in a systems thinking sort of way. If anybody's listened to Tim Brown of IDEO, a friend of mine, or many other really great thinkers of today, they're starting to talk about design thinking as a way of solving business problems. And so even the most junior person in marketing now asks, about, certain, where's the user case in this? What are the insights? How do we follow that methodology to get those insights? And that makes for a good partnership. So it was a great relationship, and they're a great company.
Yeah. Okay. We talked a little bit earlier, and we're going to talk a little bit about, or a lot about, Generation Y. Gen Y. You've done a lot of research on that, and I think that we are underestimating the potential revolutionary nature of the rise of Gen Y, and in terms of its culture, in terms of all kinds of things. And just to connect a little bit to what happened, the presentation right before here, I've been spending a lot of time, because of my parents and my wife's parents, in assisted living homes and talking, just spending a lot of time there. Actually, as a small anecdote, my mother-in-law is 93, and her memory is going, but not quite gone. She expresses herself increasingly in poetry. We all know that the long-term memory lasts the longest. And because of her age and the way she was educated, she memorized an enormous number of poems and things like that. And she expresses her emotions by quoting poetry, about 1/3 of which I recognize, given my really bad education as I was growing up in the 60s. And now she's also writing poetry for the first time in her life. And it's really quite good. Some of it's actually quite raunchy. I guess she's losing some editing function as well. It's really, it's really good. And, people live very interesting lives. And they weren't always old, right? And she's expressing herself, and it's fascinating. And it's, I spend as much time with her as possible. One of the things you see when you spend time in a nursing home is that they're a population that wants to be connected and is in fact still very connected to family. But it's very hard for them to connect unless you're there physically. And yet we live in a society where the technology allows us to connect. I mean, Gen Y is the most connected, in some ways, the most connected technologically generation that we have. It's one of the reasons why I think it's quite a revolutionary thing. And yet we have, this enormous gap between a very large population of people who are living their lives, wanting to connect, the ability to connect them, right? But the lack of will to do it. And we have a generation that knows how to do it. So in all of this, there is this sort of alliance, possible relationship between, what would they be, their grandchildren? Of the people, or more, of people being able to connect, who can connect, who want to connect, who will be able to connect. And a great need for that. So that's all I have to say about my mother-in-law.
I'd like to meet her.
She
sounds great.
Yeah, I sort of said this to my wife recently, and it's her mother, and so she would love to be connected. And put her on Skype. What is the big deal, right? and just have a very simple screen where she could push it. And then my wife said, well, what about your mother, Bruce? Think of the screen and her wanting to connect with you, and she will want to connect with you again and again and day after day and hour after hour. So be careful a little bit of what you wish for, Bruce. How much connection do you really want? Okay, that's too much information. So let's go to what we were talking about a little bit earlier. Gen Y is different in many ways, and you're kind of doing research in terms of how they work and how they interact. Can you kind of describe a little bit about what you're seeing? And
I think we're living in a world anyway now that is really defined by, I call it sort of this mega multi-pluralistic view. There's not one right view, and I think that typifies some of this research too. One thing that, if anybody's read a paper recently, they'll understand that the hypothesis we had a few years ago about some of these tensions that are going to exist in the experience of work by having 4 generations for the first time in modern history anyway, in the post-industrial or in the information age, working in the same space is going to be even more true. When you see all the headlines about the 401ks and all the headlines now, I would say the most common quote that I had last week was, wherever you thought you were going to stop working, add 10 more years to that now, based on what we're seeing in the financial markets. That may or may not be true, but what it's doing is it's driving more people to stay in the workplace longer. So I think the presentation before me was actually quite interesting to how it links. But there's this incredible pressure underneath of these incredibly talented and agile minds that are coming into the workforce with different expectations. The sweet spot for me, and I think we just have some random images scrolling in the back of, say, the last 5 years of work or so. For me, the sweet spot of design is where there's some change in behavior, some sort of sociological shift, and some change in technology. And sometimes those intersect. Where they intersect, I think, is a really interesting place for design to play. And I see it really sort of in a present way with that generation. So we had a very mature group of designers in the studio, a lot of them like me in the mid-40s, some in their late 30s, a lot of 8, 9, 10 years worth of experience. We started to deploy them in other studios around the world. And so we started to hire again after sort of a 5-year dry spell, somewhat due to the dot-com bust and some other things that went on. And so as I started to really search out some people, got a couple of great people from RISD, a couple of great people from Pratt, some great people from out west. They had more in common than the particular educational programs they went through. In a way, we were old school in the sense that we came out during a period of relative economic, sort of tough times. In the 80s, there weren't a lot of jobs, and so most people, I would say, in the couple generations above, are typified by they're really hungry still. They really are, have an intense work ethic. They're very, in a way, success focused. But then you have this generation that comes up that may have a lot of, I'll call it, expectations and demands. Sometimes one might say entitlement, but they're so technologically savvy. They've experienced so many things. In fact, I had a conversation with one of my young designers, and I said, the interesting thing is, when I was your age, I was nowhere near as developed as you. I was nowhere near as savvy, nowhere near as experienced as you. My only concern is that I feel like I'm still hungrier than you. But I think that was a misinterpretation in a sense that that's a little that old school, new school thinking that I think might have shifted a bit. Over time, what I noticed is that it's just a different set of values, and there's a lot of this notion of authenticity, a lot of this notion of I have a longer term scope to my plan. I want to make sure that kind of every move, my values and what I'm experiencing are more closely related, whereas maybe say my experience was I was willing to endure many different sort of unoptimal situations to be able to get to a particular dream that I might have had. And that really affects how you sort of develop these folks and also coach them and utilize them in business problems.
Give me some specifics.
Well, one is, say, the notion of sustainability from a social imperative standpoint, from an environmental standpoint. In my company, this is not the infomercial. It's part of our values. It's really deeply committed to sustainability. We have the most cradle-to-cradle certified products in any industry anywhere. And because we feel like so many people spend so much of their time at work or on work, and so we have a responsibility to understand at a molecular level and at a manufacturing level what goes into those things. We don't want to be part of a class action suit, but also it's just part of what we believe. Well, these guys come in and I don't think they would have worked for us in many ways if we didn't have that sort of commitment, or they didn't see that. If they saw the sort of greenwashing that was going on, they would probably be gone sooner than later. Another thing we notice is they demand the best in technology immediately. In fact, I had an incredible experience with this one designer where I had 2 consecutive weeks. I had a funny aha. One, I sat down and we had what I thought was going to be a really significant pay bump. Deliver the news, and you kind of expect a little feedback. And there was a respectful thank you. But when I gave her the new Creative Suite from Adobe, she was bouncing off the walls for 3 days. And so the things that motivate people, it's being plugged into the best and the most current at all times. And I think their notion of I need to be on the edge of my developmental limit and plugged into that, or you see signs of being discouraged quite quickly.
So they demand the best tools, the latest tools.
That's just one aspect. But I also think the demand an environment of interaction. What I love, this idea of collaborative innovation. One thing, when I went to design school, I wasn't taught how to work together. I was taught how to have brilliant ideas, protect them, and box them through, right? I don't know if anybody else went to design school in the 80s and 90s, but that's just the way it was, So I had my own studio for 11 years, and I was kind of championing that sort of, I'll call it, last century model of the genius designer, and then I took this job in '99 with Steelcase, and it really took a transition. That's the greatest thing I've learned, is that the greatest thing I can do is to create an amazing team. That's what I'm most proud of in terms of a design project. But I don't see that as simply just a matter of fulfillment. I see it as a matter of survival today. And these guys come in having collaborated through university courses, collaborated through projects, been participating in things like the Future Nursing Home. Those kind of things are just part of their sort of DNA now. And so in a way, they're teaching business how to solve big, hairy problems by sort of dropping the ego and the protectionism and actually learning that, sort of what you talked about in a company-to-company level, but sort of a person-to-person level. That's the only way to survive in business today. So we in effect turn them into reverse mentors about how to effectively solve big problems.
I've talked with a number of CEOs who, depending on their age, are really saying that their youngest employees are teaching them how to change their culture, their corporate culture, and basically teaching them how to, basically guiding them into the future. And they kind of recognize that, but they're still very grumpy about it. It's a fascinating, process, and a lot of it is this.
Yeah. I'm still trying to figure out the date where I became one of the grumpy old men. But the funny thing is I think you have to sort of understand what I run around all the time and say there's never been a greater time to be a designer than now. We're experiencing economic, political, cultural, technological instability and change at a rapid pace, and it's phenomenal. Stop checking your 401k website and start looking around for patterns, and I think you see amazing design opportunity everywhere all around us. I think it's the same way. As designers, you're trained to recognize patterns. You're trained to see the everyday in new ways. And so hopefully, I think the more enlightened executives and companies will understand it's a design problem, not in a negative sense, but a design opportunity, and say, how do these people become, drivers or an engine to help me? I don't know who it was today. I'm sorry, but you said change the business model 4 times during their career. That's probably true. Yeah. I mean, they may not be radical shifts, but they're going to be subtle enough shifts that you can find yourself. What do they say? If you're a degree or two off your path at the beginning, years later down the road, you're miles away from your goal. And I think it's understanding and having that sort of, I'll call it humbleness, to be able to say a great idea can come from anywhere, And in fact, we have a kind of a panel. We've instituted a forum where we bring in, the 25 and unders to advise, our human resource policies and attract and retain and those kind of things within our company. And we see that as a real critical advantage to us.
I know at Business Week, in the end, through no great design, the team that puts out the Innovation and Design channel and our internal magazine, Inside Innovation, is a multi-generational team. I'm the oldest, of course. I was smart enough to hire people in their early 30s when we were starting out about 5 years ago. And much to my delight, it turned out that they too were too old, so we had to hire someone in their 20s. So it was nice to see someone, give them some shit, because they were giving me plenty of it also, as being, technologically backward and all the rest of it. So multi-generational teams, if you could pull it off, I think have great potential in terms of learning from one another and guiding one another, enabling one another in different ways. I sort of enable people almost politically within the institution and get resources, and they enable me technologically, and we enable each other in terms of idea creation, ideation, and creativity.
I think based on that too, you talked about tools, but also problem-solving approaches. I mean, we do very little kind of rendering work and stuff like that in our studio. We really build a lot, but we spend a lot of time in the world of words, and then pairing those words with images, and then creating sort of articulations of those images in sort of concepts for us, right? So our process is to gain insights, and then we synthesize those into design principles, and then we take those design principles and manifest those as an expression, right? And if you think about the idea of work, people will sometimes say, "Oh, you're, Steelcase, you guys do tables and chairs." I'm like, well, we do that, but what we really do is we study work. We study the idea of work in every setting. I mean, as Richard knows, we just launched a healthcare business that's already a few $100 million, right? And that's an idea of extreme work. But the idea of what goes on around our stuff is more important than the stuff itself, right? So if you can't solve the problems of what I'll call like the ballet or the experience of work, then the stuff is irrelevant, whether it's beautiful or sustainable. And so it has to be sort of research or sort of insight based. So if you take that, what are the tools you need to do to describe conceptual work? You can't just make a model and go, that's it. So, I mean, as they came into our studio, we started to experiment with film, started new media, all kinds of these tools that we just said, these guys are pros at that. I'm not even gonna learn now, and I'm gonna be literate in that. Yeah. And it really changed the way we worked, and also changed a lot of the outcomes of what we do.
Yeah.
So.
You could really visualize experience and services and all of that through inexpensive video now.
Yeah.
It's sort of what is it? I can't do it with my hands, so I can't do it. Instead of clay in a model, you have a small video.
Exactly.
And then you iterate off of that.
Yeah, you can't. It's hard to build an experience out of clay.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what you're trying to describe. Right. I mean, the only thing about the Gen Y is that that's one big current that's driving change today. But the tensions between in the collaborative nature of work have always really been there. I mean, if anybody knows Roger Martin, we were talking about this today. There's one thing that stuck with me that when he and I spoke, and that was this notion of there's always been tension, and there's always been barriers to collaboration in work. He kind of talks about there's these reliability-based thinkers, and there's these validity-based thinkers. Has anybody heard this yet? So, okay, so if I tell it wrong, jump in. But
Roger Martin, the dean of the Rotman School of Management
in Toronto,
which is a design thinking-based business school.
Yeah, it's like David Kelly, was with his D school in Stanford. Roger's doing a great thing there, and it's happening in a lot of different places. But I like this model because it really highlights the need for breaking down certain barriers in the collaborative activities. The reliability-based people look at the validity-based people and say, they don't turn their expense reports in on time. They're irresponsible. They have long hair. All kinds of things, right? That really define. Right. Yeah, they can't spell right, maybe. although I have the same policy.
You do?
Well, it's detail orientation.
Neither one of you could hire me. I got half my traffic on my blog from people
My Gen Y guys
sending
would
it,
say,
you spelled it wrong.
My Gen Y guys would say, if they're not using adaptive text, then they don't belong here.
There is no movable type doesn't have spell check.
So they'd say the reliability-based people measure their success and motivation in managing large teams, having big titles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then the validity-based people are the kind of people who are like, I don't know how I'm going to do it. I'm going to take that hill, or I'm going to solve this problem. I'm going to do that. And there's usually a mess, and there's they can't describe their process all the time, every minute, and they're not seeking repeatable processes. They're seeking outcomes. Yes. And so they look at the reliability-based people and go, they just don't get it, right? So everybody's heard that, right? And so he's just basically saying collaborative networks within companies isn't about turning everybody into everybody else or creating one monolith of how people think. It's about creating a language of synthesis that allows these people to talk to each other. So, I would say for me, and this is actually I spent a lot of time coaching my team, is find the language to speak to the audience. So you talked about audiences today, is find the language to speak to that audience and understand the context of the message you're delivering, right? So and deliver that in the language that can be heard. And so I think collaborative tensions don't just exist between Gen Y, Gen X, boomers, and veterans. They exist between just character typologies and the way people have preferences. So work for us isn't about just tables and chairs. It's really an intense sort of social study about what people do, who they are, what tools they need, what motivates people, and the space makes a big difference in that. And so we really feel like if you look at technology tools as being sort of the virtual interface of how people solve problems, we become sort of the physical interface about what people use to solve problems, and getting people around the right tools. At the right time is really a big part of solving big problems in business today. And one mind's really rarely capable of doing that.
Literally talk about space. How do Gen Yers like to work? And how does that compare to
like this?
The reliability.
That's good. No, in fact, we have a really interesting project going on studying, diverse, sort of postures, and we kind of provocatively call it alternative postures, at work.
This is great.
What happens at work stays at work. And part of that's driven by, a couple different examples of tools are driving new behaviors. Wireless tools drive new behaviors. We've typified one thing as it's not about being at work, it's being on work. And so a lot of times when I come into my studio and no one's there, I look for their online presence. And they're on work, and I'm cool with that. And because they may be, in a lounge setting, they may be somewhere else, they may be in the factory, they may be, at home. Yeah. Work is a social experience, no doubt, but the advent of social networking has expanded the notion of that. But, and if you really integrate that into this idea of work, they have enacted something that I've just started calling it this last week, this idea of flow shifting. They're very good at that, what I've observed. I'm not very good at that. I think certain generations before have sought this notion of flow. Get in flow and stay in there as long as you can and hang on to it with white knuckles until you have to let go of it. Yeah. And that was a big notion. But now it's you see when somebody's drafting something up, they'll interact with me a couple minutes. While they're talking to me, they might be texting somebody. At first I was like, are you texting? Yeah, but it just became part of that experience, and a couple of people are better than others in my studio, but they're amazing at what I call flow shifting and being able to be effective at shorter compartments of time. So that you have to.
Because they can't.
I think it's been part of their DNA. It's not a learned thing like me. It's like, how do I Twitter? This becomes part of their thing, and so as we learn some of these things, it's what you grow up with, right? Yeah. It's like we didn't grow up with the Mac on the desktop, but it's part of my work experience because I caught that at the right time. Yeah. Versus say my mother, we've all got experiences where we've set up an email account for our 80-something-year-old mother or father and something, and they just use it differently. So they're using these tools in different ways. They're hacking them in different ways and making them part of their integral work experience, which for them is more about this contiguous notion of flow versus these, I'd say, more segmented ones. So really you have to create the atmosphere for that. So.
So you have to create the atmosphere for that. Do we have more time? Time is
Our
up?
time's up. So we're standing between lunch and
Okay.
these people.
Okay,
So.
well, let's go
Yeah.
flow
Yeah,
to
thank
lunch.
you.
Thank you.